Hello everyone, welcome to the third lecture in inclusive education. In this lecture we're going to talk about understanding the social model, which is a really key idea in doing inclusive teaching and in helping students with disabilities. But the way that we're going to do it today is, instead of me talking about theory and going through a bunch of videos and facts, I'm going to talk about my own experience with disability and try to give you a bit of a story that way. Because I think that it's one thing to learn about the different theories and the different ideas, but I think it's really important to also try to hear other people's stories. And I'm hoping that I can do that with some other people, bring some other people in as well, so that you can hear a few different stories of people who have disabilities and what their experience is. And I think that might help you to understand how to be a really good inclusive teacher. So to start with, my disability, I got a diagnosis just last year called fibromyalgia. And it has a few different categories. For the most part, it's usually categorised as a physical disability. So one of the things that you'll discover when you have students with disabilities in your class is that sometimes their disability can fall into more than one category. So for fibromyalgia, there are physical elements to it, but there's also cognitive elements to it as well. So we're going to start by doing a bit of an overview of fibromyalgia, because I'm assuming a lot of people haven't heard of it. And one of the processes we do when we have a student with a disability is we understand first what the disability is, or what the impairment is, and we look at the barriers that that impairment has, but we also look at the strengths that come with that disability. Then we look at what disables the student individually. What are the things that stops the student from functioning? And then what can remove that disability? What can allow them to function? So when we talk about the medical model, the medical model is the traditional way of thinking, and it's the idea that the person is disabled by the abnormalities and deficits of their own body or brain. So the problem is in the person, like a medical diagnosis. The disabled people are broken, abnormal, or damaged. There's something wrong with them. Since the disabled person's impairments prevent them from functioning normally, they need caregivers and professionals to make decisions for them. So this is the idea of the medical model. And in our last lecture, when we looked at beliefs and attitudes, we realised that saying that a student can't do this because they are this, saying a student can't write because they're blind, or a student can't be engaged in sport because they've got cerebral palsy, isn't actually very helpful, because each student is different and each person has different levels of functioning and different levels of coping with each situation. So the other side that we prefer to think of in terms of inclusive education is the idea of the social model. And this idea is that the person is disabled by their environment and its physical, attitudinal, communication and social barriers. So I am not disabled by the things that are wrong with my body. I am disabled by people's negative attitude toward me. I am disabled by the environment around me, that the environment might not work for me. And the social model also assumes disabled people are normal, okay? So having problems with your body and having problems with the way you think, actually everyone has that. To some degree, everyone experiences some sort of issues or some sort of things that they find difficult. But disabled people are normal, and that valid varieties of human being, they are valid varieties of human beings, and they should have equal rights and access to society. Okay? And since the disabled person is inherently equal, they have a right to autonomy, choice, and free and informed consent in their own lives. So this idea is once again um, that humanity, we all have. There's no such thing as some sort of magic dividing point of this is normal and this is abnormal. Actually, what we are thinking when we're talking about the social model is that there are degrees of functioning for all of us. We all have various degrees of physical functioning. Some of us are super athletic and some of us are uncoordinated. We all have different degrees of academic functioning. We all have different degrees of emotional functioning. And so it's kind of thinking in terms of what is actually stopping that person from functioning in the environment or in someone's attitude. All right? So, we're going to start by looking at an understanding of what fibromyalgia is, because you may not have heard of it before. And then we're going to go through a social model analysis of how we would think about a person with fibromyalgia. And I'll take you through some of my barriers, some of my strengths, and some of the things that disables me, and some of the things that removes disability for me. So we'll start with this video.
Fibromyalgia is one of the most commonly misunderstood disorders out there, which is saying something considering that there are a lot of misunderstood disorders. It's characterized by widespread pain throughout the body, making it a literal pain in the everything, but it's also difficult to figure out what causes it. And that's led some people to argue that fibromyalgia isn't even real. Admittedly, it is a controversial diagnosis, and scientists are still hotly debating a ton about it, including what role psychological factors play in causing symptoms. So let's debunk this myth up front. Fibromyalgia is not a delusion. The disorder, known in chronic pain communities as fibro, was first formally defined in 1990. It's a chronic condition that affects 2 to 8% of the population. Besides the widespread pain, it also includes symptoms like increased sensitivity to pain, difficulty sleeping, numbness, and problems with things like concentration and memory. Usually it's treated by medications or cognitive behavioral therapy, which aims to prevent patients from focusing on or panicking about their pain. But fibro has also been surrounded by controversy, and a lot of that is because psychologists have had a really difficult time figuring out how to diagnose and classify it. With such widespread symptoms, you'd think that it would be easy to take some physical measurements and diagnose someone with fibro on the spot. But it's trickier than that, because some of those symptoms can also be caused by other simultaneous conditions, like arthritis. And as for what actually causes fibromyalgia, well, here's where things get especially messy, because there are a whole lot of factors that might trigger or contribute to all of these generalized body-wide symptoms. The most famous ones are psychological or environmental. For example, those who've had significant physical injuries or experienced psychological trauma, especially in childhood, are more prone to developing fibromyalgia. To be clear, though, that definitely does not mean that everyone with fibro has experienced trauma in their lives. It's just one risk factor. Another major one is genetics. Fibro runs in families, and several studies have shown relationships between its development and dysfunctional genes controlling certain neurotransmitters, specifically serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. So getting a diagnosis isn't always easy, and neither is figuring out what causes the disorder. And all of that has led psychologists to disagree about what fibromyalgia should even be considered. Actually, that's a pretty big understatement. Over the years, there has been a ton of controversy over this. Some scientists have believed that since fibro is often linked to psychological factors, it should be categorized as a somatic symptom disorder. This is a mental condition where psychological issues manifest as physical symptoms. But other researchers have argued that it would be better classified as something else, since it can also be triggered by biology or the environment. Today, though, many scientists say that instead we should look at fibro in the context of biological, psychological, and social factors combined. Maybe unsurprisingly, this is what's known as the biopsychosocial approach. It suggests that traumatic physical or psychological events, likely in combination with a genetic predisposition, may lead to that extreme response to pain and those other symptoms. Of course, the specifics vary case to case, but all three branches are known to interact and play a role in producing fibromyalgia. The exact mechanics of how this plays out in the body, though, are so far unknown. And unfortunately, and especially because of the psychological factors involved in fibro, that's led to a common misunderstanding that patients are suffering a delusion that they're in pain rather than being in actual pain. This misunderstanding is actually so widespread that it can be difficult for those with fibro to access available treatments because they're just not being taken seriously. But you can't just shrug fibromyalgia off. Even if psychologists argue about how to classify it, current research is clear that there's nothing delusional about it. In one 2018 study, for example, researchers studying the mechanics of fibro patients' sensitivity to pain showed that their brains were acting sort of explosively in response to pain stimuli. In the study, scientists used EEGs to test 10 females with fibro, taking readings of their brain waves. The readings showed signs of so-called electrical instability, brain waves behaving more erratically than expected in response to stimuli. This made the researchers consider if what they were measuring may be similar to what's seen in something called explosively synchronizing networks. Explosive synchronization, or ES, is a phenomenon that's usually studied in fields like physics, like with power grids rather than medicine. When it happens, a tiny stimulus causes a dramatic synchronized reaction across a network. In brains, that's, explosive. To a fibro sufferer, a poke in the side that would feel like nothing to your average person becomes way more intense, becoming painful much more easily. To see if this is actually what was happening, the researchers created computer models of a brain with fibromyalgia to see how it would respond to mild stimuli. And like they suspected, the models reacted to pain in the same explosive manner that patients reported. This really tells us that fibro isn't just a case of people believing they're experiencing more pain or something to ignore. Instead, it suggests that there's a physical overreaction to pain stimuli in their brains. It may still be fuzzy what causes that, but this was a big step in the right direction, even if the study was only with 10 people. And with more research, we could someday use this model to create new treatments for fibro. There's still a long way to go, but there's lots of hope. And in the meantime, one thing is for sure, despite all of the misconceptions, fibromyalgia is nothing to ignore. Thanks for watching this episode of SciShow Psych. If you would like to keep learning about the brain and mind with us and how those things make us tick, you can go to youtube.com/SciShowPsych.
Okay, so basically, fibromyalgia. Is it doing this? Yeah, it's working. Basically, fibromyalgia, it is a physical disability, and it's caused by I am having brain fog. It is caused by when someone has an overreaction to stimulus in pain. So, for example, when someone might shake my hand, sometimes it feels much more intense than it actually is. So that's what fibromyalgia is. So we're going to start by looking at what sort of barriers that causes. Is that going to go to the next one? Yeah, thank you. So fibromyalgia is characterized by a thing called pressure points across the body. So on the body, there are 18 different points where basically people with fibromyalgia experience more pain than normal people, people without fibromyalgia. Something else about fibromyalgia, another fact about fibromyalgia is that it can be caused, triggered, or made worse by a thing called multiple chemical sensitivity. So multiple chemical sensitivity is common among those with fibromyalgia. This means that pain and symptoms can be greatly exacerbated by perfumes, colognes, cleaning chemicals, detergents, dryer sheets, campfires, food additives, new car smells, new carpet, and body soaps and more. So for me, there are certain chemicals and certain objects that cause sensitivity to me and actually cause a reaction of pain. So for me, I struggle with candles and I struggle with perfumes. So usually it's stuff with a smell for me. And I also struggle with light, which is why I have these shaded glasses. Sometimes when I read, I get really confused with what I'm reading and I'll just read the wrong word. So fibromyalgia can actually cause a type of dyslexia. So I often, when I'm reading, I'll register the wrong word in my head when I've read something, or when I've written something, I might write the wrong thing. One example, when I was first applying for work, on my resume, I thought I'd written a brilliant resume, and on my cover page, I had written down, I meant to write down that I was able to engage students using technology, but I wrote down that I was able to enrage students using technology. And I actually handed that in to an employer, and I don't know what they were, I didn't get the job. But that is an example of, because there's issues with fibromyalgia with pain signals in the brain, it actually causes other things as well. So there's a cause of multiple chemical sensitivity, and there's also issues for me with reading. Some of the things that come with fibromyalgia is that it's not just physical, it's also emotional. So because of the fear of pain, because you're always sort of wondering, am I going to have an unusual response to something I'm about to do? Some people with fibromyalgia have talked about having a shower is painful. I've never experienced that myself, but some people with fibromyalgia actually have anxiety about using the shower because the water hitting the skin is painful. I experience sometimes with clothing. I have anxiety that sometimes heavy clothing during the day feels much more heavier than it should. Feels like I'm wearing weights. And for me, sometimes I have anxiety as I go through the day, and like, is this jumper going to suddenly feel really intense? So there's also a lot of emotional stuff involved in fibromyalgia as well, and that can be a barrier. I had a student in my class that had fibromyalgia, and for her, she was constantly in a state of fear about the climate of the classroom. She had multiple chemical sensitivity, but she also had sensitivity to heat and coldness. And she had this thing where if she got cold, she would experience physical pain. And that caused her ongoing anxiety throughout the day. What if I suddenly feel cold? What if someone puts the air conditioner on without asking? What if someone opens the window? So that was a barrier for her. So the main barriers for me when it comes to trying to work in a classroom, I'll start with this big one, is fibrofog. I just had it a few minutes ago, actually. Fibrofog is where, because of pain signals in your brain firing, sometimes it just fires in a way that fogs you up and stops you from being able to concentrate, stops the flow of your speech. Sometimes you get your words muddled up. So I'm just going to show you a video of someone experiencing fibrofog. This is much more severe than I've ever experienced, because my fibromyalgia is much more mild. But this lady is just having an episode of fibrofog, and it just gives you an idea of the kind of barrier. Imagine if you're a student in a class. Imagine if you're a student in a class, and you suddenly are getting this fog. Imagine what that must feel like.
I have, however, been having a lot of issues with fibro fog, like the fact that your brain is like fogging up and with it like you don't like you can't concentrate. Oh my god, my head. I have to focus. Like my head right now is a mess. I almost like can't. Words. Do you hear that storm? Like I can't I can't create sentences anymore, and I just get so in my head that I completely lose it, and like it starts to hurt kind of now. It's all so unclear that I've been having it a lot lately. Like usually it's just like at moments when I'm like really tired or whatever, or really busy with a lot of stuff. But now it's just it keeps coming more and more, and I feel my body like getting worse as well. Obviously, I'm still like recovering from Tenerife and London and everything in between and everything after, and dancing and all that stuff. Like I'm still really recovering from it, but it just really hurts and it really sucks. I know if I told you, but I'm on new birth control now, and I have to try it for 3 months and then get back and see like how it went. But yeah, I can just feel myself like I can feel my brain like almost detaching from my body, and it just sucks. So yeah, that was it. I'm gonna watch some Orange is the New Black and then go work. Okay, talk to you guys later. Bye.
Okay, so I wanted to, share that, because that just shows you, imagine that sort of barrier that would create for someone in the classroom. I've already talked about the chronic pain and the pressure points and the multiple chemical sensitivity. The other thing in fibromyalgia is the mental health side of it. Most people with fibromyalgia also experience cognitive problems called brain fog or fibro fog. But this can also cause mental health problems like confusion, having difficulties following directions, easily being distracted. So it can cause cognitive and mental health problems as well. So those are some of the barriers. This really sums up fibromyalgia in a nutshell over here. It says, I have fibromyalgia. It's a deficiency in dopamine, serotonin, and endorphins, which are some of the body's natural painkillers. Without them, every tiny inflammation in the body that a healthy person would barely even notice feels to me like I've been hit by a truck. So that's really sums it up, because without those chemicals that are your natural painkillers, you start getting pain, you start getting foggy, and you start having reactions to things that you really shouldn't have reactions to. People really shouldn't feel pain or feel discomfort with things like candles or perfume, for example. But that's what I feel. So often when we deal with students with disabilities, we think about the barriers, but we don't ever get to the strengths. And this is a real problem if you're trying to be inclusive. It's really important when you're being inclusive to think about the strengths of the disability or the strengths of a child's diversity as well as the barriers. So for me, one of the common things for people with fibromyalgia is increased self-awareness. Because I've got those lower levels of chemicals in my body and I notice everything, it's a real awareness to the environment around me. I might notice things in the environment that no one else will notice. I have a friend that I work with who has fibromyalgia, and we joke about that when we walk into a room, we pick things up that other people don't pick up. And that's just because our bodies are really sensitive to things, and it's a real increased awareness. I like to think of it as insight as well. Another element is compassion and connection, being able to connect with other people. I think when you have fibromyalgia, I think it really helps you with empathy. Experiencing pain actually helps you to empathise with other people. Awareness of own body as well as awareness of your surrounding. Another thing is ability to slow down. Before I started having symptoms of fibromyalgia, I worked a lot without ever slowing down and kind of just went all hours of the night. I think that having fibromyalgia has really helped me to pace myself. And I've actually gotten really good at organising my time and planning my time and thinking, okay, I'm going to work this much and then I'm going to relax. And I think that I've gotten really good boundaries because of fibromyalgia with when I work and when I don't work. I think one of my favourite things about fibromyalgia is humour, ability to laugh at myself. Because when you get brain fog, you just do some of the most ridiculous things. Or you just do things in a way that's really alternative. So I like this meme because this really describes how I feel sometimes. Just going to get rid of that. Fibrofog can cause you to forget words. Look, a vibrating pigeon. And for me, that's what it's like sometimes. It's like, oh, I've forgotten what that word is for something. And so I have some sort of crazy description to describe something really normal, like a spoon. Like one of those eating things that are silver that you put in your mouth, and people have to work out that I mean a spoon. Another one is that you just do things that are bizarre that makes me laugh. Fibrofog, when you go to your microwave, enter your ATM pin and then just stand there. I have actually done that. I've actually had a moment of confusion where I've gone to the microwave and put in my PIN number. So I think that sense of humour is something that's a real strength with fibromyalgia. And other friends that I've met that also have fibromyalgia, seems the same. It seems the same sort of things. So it's important to think about what your child's strengths are and how their disability might have a positive aspect. So moving on to the next bit, what disables me? So if we're thinking in terms of the social model, we are trying to understand that it's not just your body. If we're thinking of the biosocial model, it's not just the stuff that's happening in your body, it's not just your disability, it's your surrounding. So I said earlier with the multiple chemical sensitivity, Some of the things that I have a sensory reaction to that I get overwhelmed with, stuff like sprays and bleach. So I am disabled by people who overclean. I am disabled by people who spray half the can when there's a fly. That is a struggle for me. One of the other things that disables me is bright lights. So if I'm in a room and it is just too bright, that is actually disabling for me. I love being in a room where it's dim. I love rooms that have dimmers so that you can just not turn the light off but just dim the light a bit. And of course, something that disables me is not having my glasses sometimes. But the thing about fibromyalgia is that some days you notice it, some days you don't. So there are days where I don't even need these. Another thing that disables me, and this is a pet hate when I walk into classrooms, are the way that classrooms are designed and the furniture in buildings. Because there are certain pieces of furniture that just stump me. So when I walk into a classroom, I hate this kind of setup in a classroom because with my fibromyalgia and the way I function, I am not very, I'm very clumsy and I don't have a very good sense of how close I am to different objects, and I bump into stuff all the time. And I hate this setup because if I were in a classroom like this, I would always be bumping into the tables and I'd always be tripping over and I'd always be getting stuck. So that's one thing that disables me. Another thing that disables me is the type of chairs and stools. I was teaching in one classroom as a casual, and the teacher didn't have any chairs in the class. They just had all these wobble stools because they had a lot of students with ADHD, and these are brilliant for students with ADHD. They are not brilliant for people that have a physical disability. It was really painful to try to sit on these chairs because I was trying to balance and I'm having to use my knees, which are all creaky and arthritic, and it was hell. And I do not like rooms that have these sorts of wobbly stools that you have to balance because I don't have a good sense of balance at all. And then finally, classrooms that have stairs. There are days where I'm like, if I have to climb one more stair, I swear, I'm done. And it can be really frustrating. I much more prefer elevators and I much more prefer ramps. And that is something that can disable me. Then finally, cooling systems, funnily enough. So when it comes to heat and temperature, I am actually disabled when things are too cold. So I don't like being right in front of the fan. I don't like being right in front of the air conditioner. I love the heat. So those are different things in the classroom that might disable me. So when you've got a student with a disability like autism or ADHD or a physical disability, one of the things you have to consider is what disables this student. Do bright lights disable this student? Does the furniture disable this student? What makes it hard for this student to function in my classroom? It also works for people without disabilities. If you've got someone from a different culture in your classroom, what disables that student? What stops them from functioning? If you're using Australian slang all the time and they don't know what you're talking about, that's actually disabling them. So think about all of the students. What is it that disables the boys in your class? What is it that disables the girls in your class? I've been in some classrooms where the lesson is very girly or very masculine, and it's like half of the class are kind of just switch off because of the nature of the class. So we need to think about what are barriers and what disables the people in your class. Now, on the other hand, there are things that remove disability. One of the things that removes disability for me is heat. So I love heaters. I love heating packs and bean bags. They're awesome. One of the things that I have in my classroom is I actually have blankets. So if there are students who are disabled by the cold, get a blanket. And there are days where I am feeling it in the classroom and I'll just get a blanket on and put a blanket over my knees. And I'm like, this helps me function better. This helps me teach better. And this helps you learn better. So one of the things that enables me, that removes my disability, is heat. Another thing that enables or removes my disability is ergonomic furniture. So I love chairs that have a high back in them, chairs that are comfortable. I really also love chairs that have wheels on them because sometimes I just don't want to have to stand up and move around because it's painful and it's hard. Sometimes it is so much easier just to move myself over in the chair. I've got a student that has cerebral palsy, and she's talked about the same thing, about how she personally loves a chair with wheels on it because instead of walking around the class, sometimes she can just shuffle over she's next to the teacher's desk, so she can just shuffle over to the teacher's desk, and that's just easier for her. So I quite love ergonomic furniture. I talked about light dimmers earlier. I got ahead of myself. I do that sometimes. I love light dimmers because I function really well when there's less light in the room. And this is something that could be tricky because if you have a deaf student in your class who is trying to read the teacher's lips, darkness is not a good thing. They might need more light, they might need more brightness. So we also have to think about the least restrictive environment. What is going to be the least restrictive environment for people in your class? Dimming the lights or having a really bright room? I've had to change it up as I've been teaching. There was one year that I had a class where I had heaps of students that had mental health issues, lots of students that had depression. And so that year, I had to, because the year before I'd had a lot of students with autism. So the year with autism, I had the blinds up and the lights out. So we got natural light coming into the room so that removed the disability of the synthetic light for the kids with autism. But when I had the next year and I had all these students with mental health difficulties and barely any autistic students, we went the complete opposite way. We coloured in the windows in all kinds of bright pink and yellow and green and blue, all sorts of bright colours to brighten the room up to have a happy atmosphere because being in a dark room was not good for people with mental health issues. So sometimes you have to think about what is the least restrictive environment for my class. The last thing that I really love is the class design. So I love shoehorn classes because there's nothing to bump into for me. I love being able to go to everyone in the class and be able to move around in the middle and get everyone talking to each other. This is another alternative. This one is where you have middle and you have people kind of facing different directions. Some students with autism really love having these sort of barricades because they take in so much sensory information. They like having a barricade to kind of block out the extra information. I personally like that as well. But I do like this kind of setup because I can be in my wheelie chair, I can access everyone in the room without having to stand up, or vice versa, I can ask them to come to me. I also like it because I can move around and see everyone and give people different options. There are people who can get direct instruction from the front. There are people who can work in a group in the middle. So this is what I really like. So that is something that removes my disability. So I'm hoping that by talking about it in this way, that I'm helping you to understand the difference between the medical and the social model, because if we think in terms of the social model, we are actually, as teachers, we're actually in the practice of healing. We can actually remove barriers for people and remove disabilities for people by thinking about what disables this student. One of the things for me as well is this idea of invisible disabilities. So fibromyalgia is an invisible disability. So I think I might start by looking at this video of invisible disability. This is a person with a physical disability, and she just explains what an invisible disability is. So basically, an invisible disability is where you've got something that disables you that you can't quite see. So, for example, I'll start with this picture actually. Fibromyalgia is one of them, but dyslexia is another invisible disability. Students with dyslexia is a reading problem. When you're talking to them in the classroom, there's no indication that they have a disability. Students with dyslexia can be so intelligent and have so much knowledge, but what they struggle with is they struggle with decoding when they read. Another one is arthritis between the joints. You can't see it. Crohn's disease is with the stomach. Can't see that. ADHD. A lot of teachers walk in and they might just see a student and they might think the student's misbehaving. Actually, they've got ADHD. They've got attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, I think is the acronym. I might have got that wrong. I'll check later. So this lady talks about what invisible illness is, and we'll just have a look at that.
Hi, I'm Bethany. I'm 18 years old. I'm studying for a degree in politics and sociology, and I have chronic pain because I have an invisible illness known as a non-radiographic axial spondyloarthritis. Really lucky I got that out in one go. So, a non-radiographic axial spondyloarthropy is a condition split into 3 different sections. So the condition is non-radiographic, meaning it doesn't show up on scans. Generally, a non-radiographic condition is one that doesn't show up on x-rays, but mine doesn't show up on MRIs either, meaning I was undiagnosed for almost 6 years. It is an axial condition, meaning it affects your axial skeleton, which essentially is from here up, but my condition also affects my pelvis and my legs. And a spondyloarthritis is an umbrella term for a group of inflammatory arthroses. So what I basically just said is I could have saved you a lot of time by telling you I have arthritis. But where's the fun in that? So chronic pain, more generally speaking, is officially defined as any pain that lasts for 3 months or longer. But that is ridiculously reductionist and overly simplistic. Chronic pain is far more than just pain. It is disabling. It is isolating. It has bad effects on your mental health, as many studies have shown that there is a positive correlation between the amount of chronic pain suffered, the length of the chronic pain, and the severity of depression suffered. Chronic pain impacts your social life, your work, your school, your physical state, obviously. Chronic pain is more than just pain. So the chronic pain that I'm talking about today is generally invisible. There are conditions where chronic pain is visible, but the vast majority are invisible illnesses. To define it a bit more specifically, an invisible illness is an illness that can't be seen to the naked eye. So I can walk on here and none of you know that I'm disabled, but I am. So when you have an invisible illness, you have to come out of the medical closet because no one knows that you're disabled. There are millions of ways to do it and everyone does it differently. But there are generally 3 reactions that you get. The first is just a very awkward noise, which generally resembles and then a sad face, and then you just both feel uncomfortable. It's not that great. But more than just showing that the person you're telling is uncomfortable with your specific illness, it resembles the fact that society in general is uncomfortable with disability, with long-term illness. When you tell somebody you're unwell, chronically, you're telling them that you're different to a lot of people in society. You're telling them that you're not normal or not average. And oftentimes that's kind of hard to cope with. The second reaction, which you often get when you are young or when you have a joint problem, is that you are just too young to be ill. And this is a really annoying response, but I'm going to say it's allowed on one condition. And that is if you have a very personal connection to the overlord of chronic illness and disability, and you can get my condition reversed until I'm of a more suitable age. But everyone that's told me that I'm too young so far hasn't had such a connection, so they're banned. And this again shows that when you have a chronic illness, when you have an invisible illness, it doesn't fit into what a disabled person should be. I should be 80 to have arthritis, but unfortunately, I'm not. I'm 18. And carrying on from that, another very similar reaction is that I don't look sick. And I understand that often when people tell me that, it's actually meant as a compliment. But all it's telling me is actually I shouldn't be ill because I don't look ill. Because I don't fit into the very strict criteria of what you should be to be disabled. These reflect major stereotypes that are interwoven into our social structures that dictate the lives of those who are disabled. They tell you that unless you are visibly ill, of a certain age, or look a certain way, then you're allowed to be disabled. But if you're not any of those three, you're not disabled. As I said, these stereotypes are held by millions of people in society. And it means that you have to prove yourself, whether it's having a massive badge that says I am disabled, whether it's by maybe walking with a more profound gait, whether it's by having a walking stick or a mobility aid, or going to doctors and saying, please believe me that my back pain is actually bad and I promise it's not growing pains. Whether it's telling friends when you can't go out to a social event that it's because you're ill or you're in pain and not because you don't like them or because you're lazy. Whatever it is, you spend a long time proving you're ill because people just won't believe you. I would love to say that these stereotypes are only held by people who have a very limited experience of disability, be it a first or second-hand experience. I can't say that. When I was 16, I was about 4 years into my chronic illness journey, and I went to see a rheumatologist, which is a joint doctor. I was at a period in my life where I was undiagnosed, I was very sick, and I was seeing a ridiculous amount of doctors on a very regular basis to try and figure out what was wrong with me. So I sat down in front of this doctor and I gave him my pre-rehearsed spiel about I got sick when I was this age and then my pain spread here and then I tried this medication. And he asked me the normal doctor questions, and then he kind of sat back and thought, and that is where the dangerous bit came in. He told me that I had a pain processing problem. And I was, after I heard that, euphoric for like 2 seconds. Because as I said, I was 16 and I was undiagnosed. I'd suffered from very severe chronic pain for 4 years. And suddenly this fight that I was having against this faceless illness was suddenly recognised, appreciated, and had a name, which made me a bit stronger. I had one up on this entity that was fighting me. I had a pain processing problem. So then I had to ask him what a pain processing problem is. And in the words of this doctor, a pain processing problem is when you experience the pain that everyone experiences because you're human. And everyone experiences pain, so that kind of made sense. But a toxic mentality that you hold means that you focus so much on this pain, it gets worse and worse and worse because of the way you think about it. My pain was all in my head, according to the doctor, that had met me for 5 minutes and didn't know anything about the chronic pain I had or how it affected me. I would love to say that the stereotypes held by that doctor really only affect me. I've taken the burden for everyone else suffering from a chronic illness, and nobody else is going to have to see a doctor who treats them with that little respect or recognition. But I can't say that. And that is why I'm here today, to explain to all of you what it is like to be ill, when you kind of shouldn't be, when people think you shouldn't be. There are very many ways to combat the stereotypes and to fight the views that are held by people that are frankly oppressive and really change your life for much worse. One of the ways to fight these stereotypes is to tell doctors where they can shove their pain processing problems. Doesn't work that well. A more productive thing to do is to educate yourself on what a chronic illness is, what chronic pain is, and understanding it's a lot more than just pain. And understanding the stereotypes that affect people every day and how deeply interwoven they are into our society. I mentioned a bit about growing pains. When you're young and have had chronic pain, it doesn't matter how long for, doctors generally will always ask you, come back in a month because it's probably growing pains. It's not growing pains. And these are the type of things, growing pains, the wonderful doctor I mentioned before, shows the things that we have to fight against daily. But with education and with understanding, even if it's just you, it will start to change the lives of other people. Because suddenly this fight that they're having, that they have to fight on their own, doesn't become this lonesome battle anymore. If you can understand and start to appreciate that if you're not in a wheelchair, you can still be disabled, that if you're not 80 years old, you can still have arthritis, and that people of many ages suffer many invisible illnesses, you are 10 steps closer to making millions of lives easier. Education and understanding will eradicate the isolation that people with invisible illnesses experience on an everyday basis. You can educate yourself by watching talks like me, thank you very much, by reading things online, by talking to people you know who suffer from conditions like arthritis, fibromyalgia, Crohn's disease, Perthes disease, etc. If you start talking, if you start conversations, the understanding will spread. And as I said, that eradicates isolation. It means the invisibility cloak that is forced on us when we realise we are disabled when we shouldn't be, that invisibility cloak will be ripped off us. The stitches of these stereotypes will be snipped. And the fight that we have every single day will become so much more visible and so much more easy to fight because we will no longer be fighting a one-man battle. Thank you.
Okay, so there was a lot in that video. There's a lot to unpack. But as we go on to, so as we've talked about strengths and barriers, and then we've talked about what disables you and what does not, what removes the disability. One of the things that we need to understand is that disability can be invisible, and aspects of a person's disability can be invisible. There are experiences that people go through that can be really hard. Not all disabilities look like this. Some look like this. Okay? So that is something that's important to understand. So let's look at how you can include people with invisible disabilities in your class. Some disabilities are visible. For example, ADHD, dyslexia some disabilities are invisible. For example, ADHD, dyslexia, Crohn's disease, mental health, mental illness, and brain injury. Because these conditions are hidden, there is often stigma and misunderstandings around them. So, as it was said in the first video, explaining fibromyalgia, one of the things that I've had to live with is this idea of stigma, which is this idea that you're different. There's something wrong with you and you're not the way, you're too young to have a disability. There's something not right there. Even though disability may be invisible, your response is always visible. Think of a child screaming in public or someone in visible distress. Do you ignore them, cast disapproving looks, or just calmly help if you can? People with disabilities want you to hear, understand, and respond to them. It is okay to ask someone to repeat a question, to say that you don't understand, and to ask them about other methods of communication. Ask the person what they prefer. So one of the things that's really important is when you're working with students with disabilities is to actually be in dialogue with them. Don't assume that someone with a vision impairment needs Braille. Don't assume that a person with a hearing impairment wants to communicate via sign language. Talk to the person and say, what do you need? How do you want to communicate? So I'm going to leave this up on the forum for people who want to read that in more detail, because I don't want to take up too much time reading that. But one of the things we have to think about is how do we help students when you can't see everything that is about their disability. I want to share one strategy that has worked really well for myself, and this is called the spoon theory. So for people with chronic pain conditions like fibromyalgia, the spoon theory is a way to organise yourself. So one of the things I do when I'm triggered, so what I mean by triggered is that there are days where I'm not experiencing much pain, and there are days where certain stimulus is really getting to me and I'm experiencing a lot of pain. And so when I'm having a really bad day, one of the things I do is I get 12 spoons. It's hilarious. I get 12 plastic spoons and I start to think about what have I done through the day that's worn me out. And so the spoon theory, this is just an example. You might say for activities like getting out of bed, getting dressed, watching the TV, that might be 1 spoon. Having a shower, styling your hair, that might be 2 spoons. That's harder. Then other things like driving somewhere, doing housework, that might be 3 spoons. And going to work for the day might be 4 spoons, or going shopping might be 4 spoons. And for me, I know that there are certain activities that take my spoons away and that rob me of my spoons. I know that driving is something that is a 4-spoon activity for me. It really takes my spoons away. Something else is being on a lunch duty at school when you have to stand up and walk around. That takes away a lot of spoons for me. And one of the things that I sometimes talk to students about is how many spoons is that? So I've got a student with a physical disability and she was stressed about having to do a test. And one of the discussions was, is this a 1-spoon thing or is this a 4-spoon thing? And she's like, oh, it's about 3 spoons. It's about that much stress. And so this is a strategy that has really worked for me in helping me when I'm like, I'm doing too much, I need to slow down, or I need to rest, I need a break. So the last thing I want to talk about is when we have disabilities, one of the things I've experienced is this concept of pathologizing. So I've experienced this type of having an invisible disability and people not realising I have a disability and having to come out as disabled. But another thing that I've experienced is pathologizing. So pathologizing is when you regard or treat a student as psychologically abnormal. It's when you only see the impairment and you forget to see the person there. One of the things that is really hard for doctors, I think, is that doctors have to be clinical, they have to be scientific, and a lot of doctors find it hard to be personal. And as a teacher, we're not expected to be clinical. We are actually expected to be personal, and we are expected to build relationships with our students. So yes, we have to see the disability, but we also have to see the child. So one way of talking about this is by being holistic. we have to say one of the things that my mother has fibromyalgia as well, and one of the things that she used to say is, the disability is part of my life, it's not my whole life. And she used to say that when it came to supporting her, disability was just a part of her life. And this is the same thing for our children. Our children still are going to go through the same things that all children go through. They're still going to have relationships. They're still going to have issues with their families. And when we pathologise, we're only seeing the impairment and we're forgetting about everything else. The other thing about pathologising is diagnosing everything as if everything is a medical problem, even though the issue or barrier might be social. So I've got an example here. This is from the 1850s. In the past, we've come up with quite a few different disabilities and conditions that later we've decided actually that's not a thing. And this is one of them. One condition in the 1850s that they came up with was drapetomania. And this was the mental illness that made slaves want to run away. So in the 1850s, there was this idea that African Americans were inferior and that it was their natural kind of plot in life to be a slave. And that African Americans wanted to be slaves because that was what they were good at, that's what their position was, that was their God-given designation in life. And so to defend this kind of racist thinking, some people decided and felt that slaves running away was actually a mental illness. It wasn't at all that they didn't want to be a slave and that it was a social injustice. They thought, no, these people are unwell because that's not normal for a slave to want to run away. They have drapetomania. We need to start diagnosing them and giving them support so they can get over this running slave syndrome. So that is something that can happen when we pathologise. That's an extreme example, but sometimes it happens in the classroom. Sometimes we start putting diagnostic labels on a student when it's just like, actually, this student just needs to be loved, or this student has a concern that just needs to be met. Sometimes things are social and not medical. One example of this is with autistic children. One misconception that you get for students that have autism is this idea that they play wrong. So what is inappropriate play? Autistic children do not play in inappropriate ways. Okay, so one of the misconceptions for students with autism, let me say this better, is that when you see them playing and you see them not making eye contact, you see them not doing the games the way other students normally do it, a misconception is that there's something wrong with the child. We need to fix that. We need to teach them how to play properly. But autistic children do not play in inappropriate ways. They just play and learn in unique ways and in different ways. So we need to make sure that we don't pathologise our ways of being and how we understand the world around us. Just because it's not your experience doesn't mean that it's wrong. Sometimes children with disabilities just do things in a different way, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes students with disabilities will do things in a way that might seem bizarre to you, but if it works for them, let them have a go. There was one student I had who loved lying on the floor to work. And there was a while where I thought, we need to teach this student how to sit at a table like everyone else. But actually, they just had a different way of working. They lied on the floor on their stomach, and they got so much more work done when they did that. And sometimes we actually have to stop pathologising and stop making children be normal or normal. One of the things is that with pathologizing is that it does happen in the medical community. So for people with fibromyalgia, this is a piece of research over here. It says many doctors, so this is talking about doctors and health professionals, have the attitude that female fibromyalgia patients are weak, complaining, and overreacting. That is an attitude that's not helpful. In our last lecture, we talked about attitudes and beliefs. This is an attitude that's not actually helpful. And this was in the video of the lady that we just watched. Other health professionals identify male fibromyalgia patients as not seeking healthcare for health problems. So that's another difference. That's something that doctors do to pathologize fibromyalgia. Many doctors see fibromyalgia as a woman's disease. So sometimes when we make a diagnosis for a disease, it is based on a certain gender. This happens with autism. So the original test for fibromyalgia was designed for women. And because of this, a lot of men never get a diagnosis. It took me something like 7 or 8 years to get a diagnosis. It took a really long time. And it's only just now that people are realising that the symptoms of fibromyalgia in men are different to the symptoms in women. Some disabilities affect different genders differently. It's the same in autism. Autism is the other way around. The original tests for autism was based on boys. And lots of girls that had autism never got a diagnosis. And we're just now realising that girls experience autism differently to boys, and that's why they often don't get diagnosed as much. We also need to think about the experience of pain. As we talked about in the video earlier, the biopsychosocial model, I think it's really beneficial to bring the biopsychosocial model to all disabilities, because all disabilities have biological factors like genetics, physiology, neurochemistry, what's happening in the brain, but there's also psychological factors. As soon as you get the label of a disability, that comes with stigma. It's like, that's stamped, that's what you are now. Actually, that's probably more social. But there's psychological factors. You can become anxious or depressed because of your pain. You can become anxious or depressed because of your difference. There's also social factors, like needing social support or extra social learning or socioeconomic status. Certain disabilities really affect your ability to get employment. People with a vision impairment, for example, are 3 times more likely to not get employed. So we have to think of things in the biopsychosocial matter. Another thing about pathologizing is the way that we classify disability in different states. One of the things that you might have realised already is that the categories of disability in Australia differs in every state, which is super confusing. So to give you an example, in New South Wales, intellectual disability is defined by an IQ. So you do an IQ test with a psychologist, and depending on your score, you get a type of intellectual disability. So mild is 56 to 75, moderate is 31 to 55, and if you've got a severe intellectual disability, you're lower than 30. That's New South Wales, which is very medicalised. However, I've almost forgotten which state, in Queensland, there's a big difference. Intellectual disability is also got social and observable elements. So in Queensland, it says intellectual disability is significantly sub-average intellectual functioning, and it's also significant limitations in 2 or more related skills, such as communication, being able to look after yourself, social skills, and so on. So in New South Wales, it's very pathologised. It's a test, and that's it. Whereas in Queensland, it's very biopsychosocial. It's looking at the biological element through the test, but it's also looking at the psychological element, and it's looking at the social side of it. Do they have problems with social skills? Do they have problem with health and safety? Do they have problem with functional academics? If that is the case, and that also is important for that diagnosis of intellectual disability. So we need to start thinking in terms of moving away from pathologizing and just making everything medical and understanding that there is a social aspect to people's disabilities. So I'm going to end on this video, which kind of expands on that.
According to the medical model of disability, the word disabled means less able. Less able to achieve your potential, less able to have meaningful relationships, less able to play an active part in the world around you, and that this is just your bad luck. This outdated view of the world puts the responsibility of overcoming disabling barriers on the person with an impairment. But this idea is changing. The more modern social model of disability says that a person doesn't have a disability, but that they are disabled. They are disabled by society. It is the attitudes and physical barriers imposed on them by society that prevents them from achieving their potential. The social model was developed by disabled people and their allies to help them take action against discrimination and to empower people to find solutions, remove barriers, and campaign together for equality and human rights. They showed how people with lots of different impairments face many of the same problems. These disabling barriers include prejudiced opinions and attitudes, restricted access, and people being systematically excluded. The social model looks for the ways that society can be planned and organised in order to provide accessibility, independence, and opportunity in a way that enables people rather than disables them. What we learn from the social model of disability is that disability is a social construct created by social barriers, barriers which can be eliminated. We learn that it is the responsibility of government, public spaces, businesses, and individual people to make the changes, to increase the access, and build a more equal society where everyone has the opportunity to reach their full potential.
Okay. So that's the end of this lecture. The main take home from this is that I really wanted you to understand the idea of the social model, the idea that every student faces barriers and strengths, that every student has something that might disable them, and then there are other things that can remove disabilities. That students in your class have things going on that are invisible, that you can't see, and taking off that invisibility cloak so that everyone can see what's going on is something that is liberating. And then the last thing that we want to move away from pathologizing and move towards a biopsychosocial model where we're considering the social elements of their disability, the physical, and the biological. So in the next lecture, I'm going to be talking about policy and legislation for disability, which is very helpful for your second assessment. I've also got another lecture coming soon where I talk about my experience with inclusion from a racial point of view. I'm my ethnicity is African American. So I look forward to sharing those lectures with you, and I hope that these lectures online are really helping you to understand the content and to get some insight into how you can help students with disabilities, how you can help students with different ethnicities, how you can help students that are poor or other things that might be barriers. Please continue to leave messages in the forum, ask questions in the forum, and I'll see you in the next lecture.